The winter of 1878 came down on the Blackwood territory like a hammer. It was not a slow, creeping cold that announced itself with gentle frosts and crisp mornings. It was an invasion, a sudden and brutal occupation of the land. The sun, a pale disk in a steel-gray sky, offered light but no warmth. The wind, born in the vast, frozen emptiness of the north, was not merely a movement of air. It was a physical force, a relentless predator that hunted for any crack, any seam, any weakness in the works of man. It scoured the valleys and screamed over the ridges, carrying with it a fine, sharp snow that felt like sand against the skin. For the settlers in the small, hopeful town of Providence, this was not their first winter, but it felt like the first one that truly intended to break them. The cold did not knock before it entered their homes. It seeped through the walls of their carefully constructed log cabins, cabins built according to the wisdom passed down through generations. The log walls were thick, felled from the giants of the surrounding forest. The gaps were chinked with a mixture of mud, dried grass, and lime, a recipe that had served their fathers and their fathers' fathers in the gentler lands they had left behind. But here, in this unforgiving territory, that wisdom was proving to be a thin blanket against a blizzard. The cold found the microscopic fissures in the chinking, turning them into gaping wounds. It flowed through them like a thief, stealing the precious heat that families fought so hard to create. Inside these cabins, life became a constant battle. The iron stoves, fed with a ceaseless diet of split oak and pine, glowed a menacing red, yet their heat seemed to vanish a few feet from their surface. A man could stand close enough to singe his trousers and still feel a draft like a knife at the back of his neck. Frost grew on the interior walls, delicate, beautiful patterns of ice that were a testament to their failure. It crept from the corners and framed the window panes, a lovely and lethal decoration. At night, families slept huddled together, buried under every blanket and quilt they owned, listening to the wind howl and the timbers of their homes groan in protest. The struggle was universal, a shared misery that bound the community of Providence together. They saw the same desperation in each other's eyes at the trading post, the same weary lines etched by sleepless, cold nights. They all burned through their woodpiles at an alarming rate, watching the stacks they had labored all summer to build dwindle with terrifying speed. Silas, a man whose hands had built more than half the cabins in the settlement and whose opinion on any matter of construction was taken as gospel, found himself just as vulnerable as the newest arrival. His own home, a model of the traditional craft, was bleeding heat. His wife kept a kettle on the stove at all times, not for tea, but so the steam might add a fleeting illusion of moisture and warmth to the air. Even he, the master builder, had no answer. This was simply the price of living in the Blackwood territory. It was a test of endurance, and the only strategy was to endure. But one man in the settlement was not fighting the same battle. His name was Elias, and he was an outsider in more ways than one. He had arrived the previous spring, a quiet widower with a young daughter, Anna, whose large, solemn eyes seemed to absorb the world in silence. Elias spoke little, and when he did, his words were soft, with a strange, lilting accent from a land of mountains and stone none of them had ever seen. He was not a large man, nor was he boastful. He listened more than he talked, and his quiet, observant nature was often mistaken for simplicity. He kept to himself, asking for no help and offering no unsolicited advice, a fact for which the proud men of Providence were grateful. When Elias began to build his cabin at the edge of the settlement, it became a source of quiet amusement and later, open mockery. He did not build like the others. He felled his logs with the same skill, squared them with the same precision, and notched them with an expert's hand. But when it came time to stack them, he did something that, to the men of Providence, was pure foolishness. He used no chinking. He laid the massive logs one on top of the other, fitting them so snugly that a knife blade could scarce find purchase. But he left the exterior gaps bare. There was no mud, no moss, no lime. Just wood against wood, with dark, empty space between the rounded outer edges. Silas, feeling a sense of duty, had approached him one afternoon in the late summer. "Elias," he had said, his voice laced with the easy authority of experience, "that won't do. A wall like that has no heart. The wind will pass through it as if it were a sieve. You'll freeze your little girl solid come first frost." He pointed to the unsealed gaps. "You need to pack that. Pack it tight." Elias had simply nodded, his eyes on the log he was shaping. "I have a different kind of mortar in mind, Silas," he had replied, his voice calm and even. He offered no further explanation. The word spread. Elias's Folly, they called the cabin. Men would stop by on their way back from the forest, leaning on their axes and shaking their heads. "He's building a corn crib, not a house," one said, spitting tobacco juice near the foundation. Another laughed. "That cabin will whistle a fine tune when the north wind blows. A funeral dirge, I reckon." The laughter was not entirely cruel. It was born of certainty. They knew how to build. They knew what worked. And what Elias was doing was not just different, it was wrong. It was a dangerous, ignorant pride, and they predicted a harsh lesson was coming for the quiet man and his child. They warned him that his foolishness would cost him dearly, but Elias only smiled faintly and continued his work. His novel idea was not in the stacking of the logs, but in what was yet to come. It was a method he had learned as a boy in his homeland, a place where the wind was a sculptor of mountains, and the winters were long and deep. It was a place where they did not fight the cold with fire alone, but with mass and with an unforgiving seal against the air. He waited until the cabin's shell was complete, the roof on and the door hung. To the rest of the town, the structure looked skeletal, unfinished. It was an invitation for the winter to come inside and stay. But for Elias, the real work was only just beginning. He began to work alone, his movements methodical and unhurried, as if the coming winter were a distant appointment and not an imminent threat. His daughter Anna played nearby, a small, silent companion in the vast stillness of the woods. She gathered stones and arranged them in patterns, or sat on a stump, watching her father with an unwavering trust that seemed to insulate them both from the town's derision. Elias worked with a patience that bordered on religious devotion. His tools were his hands, a small trowel, and a wooden mallet. His material was not something bought from the trading post, but something he harvested himself. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, he would walk the 2 miles to the Blackwood River. He carried 2 large wooden buckets, and he did not stop at the sandy banks where the others watered their livestock. He followed a small, winding tributary to a secluded bend where the water ran slow and deep. There, beneath a layer of dark topsoil and gravel, was a thick vein of blue-gray clay. It was smooth and dense, cool to the touch, and held a plasticity that common mud lacked. To anyone else, it was just dirt. To Elias, it was the heart of his home. He would dig for hours, filling his buckets with the heavy, wet earth, and then begin the long, arduous walk back, his shoulders straining under the load. While Elias hauled his clay, the rest of Providence was engaged in a frenzy of last-minute preparations. They were splitting the last of their wood, banking soil against their foundations, and patching their chinking. Silas, seeing a crack in his own wall, mixed a fresh batch of mud and lime and forced it into the gap, smoothing it over with a confident hand. He glanced over toward Elias's Folly, where the man was now laboriously mixing the river clay with a small amount of sand and water in a large trough. Silas shook his head. The fool was making bricks when he should be stockpiling wood. The whole town was a picture of sensible, frantic industry, reinforcing the known methods. Elias, in his quiet corner, was a portrait of strange, isolated diligence, practicing an art no one understood. His process was meticulous. He did not simply smear the clay onto the logs. He worked from the inside first, forcing the dense mixture deep into the crevices between the timbers. He used his fingers, his palms, and the small trowel, pushing and packing until every void was filled, until the clay was not just a plug, but an integral part of the wall itself. He worked his way around the single room, inch by inch, creating a smooth, seamless inner layer. The blue-gray clay dried to a pale, stone-like hardness. When he was finished with the interior, he began on the outside, repeating the process with the same painstaking care. He was not just sealing the gaps, he was creating a continuous, monolithic barrier. The logs provided the structure, but the clay, he knew, would provide the sanctuary. It would hold the heat, not just block the wind. It was thermal mass, an idea as foreign to the other settlers as the language of his homeland. The great storm arrived on a Tuesday. It did not come with the fury of a sudden squall, but with a chilling, deliberate solemnity. The sky, which had been a flat, hard gray for days, deepened to the color of a bruise. The air grew unnaturally still, and a profound silence fell over the forest, the kind of silence that precedes a momentous event. The animals knew it. The birds vanished. Even the ever-present rustle of the pines ceased. Then the first flakes of snow began to fall, not light and feathery, but small, hard pellets that ticked against the cabin roofs like thrown gravel. The temperature plummeted. Within an hour, the wind began its assault. For the people of Providence, huddled in their cabins, the first night was a battle of attrition. The wind was a physical presence, a battering ram that slammed against their walls. The finely crafted chinking, which had seemed so robust in the calm of autumn, began to fail. The intense cold made it brittle, and the constant vibration of the wind created hairline fractures. Soon, the fractures became cracks, and the cracks became holes. Little puffs of snow, fine as dust, began to spray into their homes. The wind found these new entrances and screamed through them, making the candle flames dance and die. The settlers stuffed rags, bits of wool, anything they could find, into the breaches, but it was like trying to dam a river with their hands. Inside Silas's home, the situation was dire. His family was crowded around the stove, which he fed with a desperate intensity. The firebox roared, devouring log after log, but the heat was being stolen as fast as it was produced. A fine layer of snow was gathering beneath the windows, and the frost on the walls was no longer a delicate pattern, but a thick, white crust. His wife was trying to keep the children calm, telling them stories, but her voice was tight with fear. Silas, the man who had built this cabin with his own 2 hands, felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. His expertise, his tradition, his pride, it was all turning to dust, blown away by a wind he could not stop. He was losing. At the edge of the settlement, in Elias's Folly, the storm was a different experience. Outside, the wind howled with the same demonic fury. It slammed against the log walls, searching for purchase, for a way in, but it found nothing. The river clay, cured by the dry autumn air and now frozen to the density of rock, had become one with the wood. There were no cracks, no seams, no fissures for the wind to exploit. The walls did not vibrate, they stood firm, a solid, silent mass against the gale. The sound of the storm was muted, a distant roar rather than an immediate assault. Inside, a small, steady fire burned in the stone hearth. It was not a roaring inferno, but a calm, efficient flame that licked gently at a single, slow-burning log of oak. The air was still. There were no drafts. A candle on the simple wooden table burned with a tall, unwavering flame. The interior clay walls, cool to the touch, were doing their work. They had absorbed the heat from the fire throughout the day, and now they were radiating it back into the room, a gentle, even warmth that filled the entire space. Anna was not huddled by the fire. She was asleep in her small bed in the corner, under a single wool blanket, her breathing deep and untroubled. Elias sat at the table, reading a worn book by candlelight, the picture of tranquility in the heart of the tempest. His creation was being tested by the worst the north could offer, and it was holding. It worked. The storm raged for 2 days and 2 nights without pause. For the settlers of Providence, it was an eternity of cold, fear, and shrinking woodpiles. On the 3rd morning, the wind finally abated, leaving behind a world transformed. The snow was piled in monstrous drifts, sculpting the landscape into a smooth, white, alien terrain. A deathly silence had replaced the roar of the wind, and the temperature had dropped even further, settling into a deep, biting cold that was even more dangerous than the storm itself. It was a cold that froze the marrow in a man's bones. In Silas's cabin, the battle was over, and the cold had won. They had burned through a shocking amount of their winter wood, and still, the interior was barely above freezing. Every wall was coated in a thick layer of ice. His children were pale and listless, bundled in so many layers they could barely move. Their breath plumed in the air. The last of their water barrel was frozen solid. Silas knew they could not survive another week like this, let alone another month. Desperate, and with a dawning, terrible suspicion, he decided to do the one thing he had ridiculed all autumn. He would check on the fool at the edge of town. He expected to find a tragedy, to find Elias and his daughter frozen in their beds, a grim testament to the man's stubborn pride. Part of him felt a grim duty to witness it. Another, smaller part, prayed he was wrong. The journey was a brutal effort. The snow was waist-deep, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Each inhalation was like swallowing needles. When he finally reached Elias's cabin, he was struck by its appearance. There were no telltale signs of distress. No frantic smoke billowed from the chimney. Instead, a thin, lazy wisp of gray curled calmly into the still air. The cabin itself looked serene and undisturbed, as if it were a natural part of the frozen landscape. Silas hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and a strange, unfamiliar hope. He raised a gloved hand and knocked on the solid wood door. The door swung open, and the first thing that hit Silas was not a sight, but a feeling. It was a wave of warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overfed stove, but a calm, steady, and profound warmth that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. It was the kind of warmth he had not felt since the last days of autumn. Standing in the doorway was Elias, dressed not in heavy furs, but in a simple wool shirt. Behind him, his daughter Anna sat at the table, playing with a small wooden doll, her cheeks rosy with health. Silas stood there, speechless, the frigid air from outside swirling around his legs. He stared into the room. There were no drafts, no plumes of breath. The single candle on the table was perfectly still. The fire in the hearth was impossibly small, a few logs burning with a quiet, hypnotic rhythm. He looked at the walls. They were clean, bare, and free of any frost. He took a hesitant step inside, and Elias closed the door, shutting out the brutal world and sealing them in a cocoon of warmth and silence. Silas was so stunned he could not form a complete sentence. "How?" he finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. Elias did not boast. He did not say, "I told you so." His expression was one of quiet empathy, not triumph. He simply gestured for Silas to take a seat at the table. "The walls," Elias said, his voice soft. "The clay holds the heat from the fire. The logs are the bones, but the clay is the flesh. It breathes the warmth back into the room. The wind cannot get in, so the heat cannot get out. He walked to the wall and placed his hand on the smooth, hard surface. It is an old way from my home. We learned to make the earth our blanket. Silas, the master builder, the man whose word on wood and stone was law in Providence, walked to the wall as if in a trance. He reached out and touched it. It was not icy cold, as his own walls were. It was cool, yes, but it was a solid, neutral cool, the temperature of a stone resting in a cellar, not a wall under siege by an Arctic winter. He ran his hand over the seamless joint where two massive logs met, a joint that on the outside was a deep crevice, but on the inside was a smooth, impenetrable surface. He pressed his ear against it and heard nothing but a deep, profound silence. There was no whistling wind, no creaking timber. There was only peace. In that moment, all of his pride, all of his certainty, all of his generations of inherited wisdom collapsed into a single, humbling realization. He was wrong. He had been dangerously, arrogantly wrong. News of the miracle in Elias's folly spread not like wildfire, but like the slow, seeping warmth that filled the cabin itself. Silas, humbled and shaken, returned to his home and told his wife. He then went to his nearest neighbor, a man named Thomas, whose infant son was sick with a lung-rattling cough, and told him. The story was so unbelievable that it had to be true. One by one, then in small groups, the men of Providence made the same pilgrimage through the deep snow to the small cabin at the edge of the settlement. Their reactions were all the same. They would arrive, shivering, their beards caked with ice, expecting to offer condolences or aid. They would knock, and the door would open to that same impossible wave of calm, steady warmth. They would step inside and fall silent, their eyes wide with disbelief. They saw the tiny, efficient fire. They saw the healthy, warm child. They touched the smooth, frost-free walls. The place that they had mocked as a sieve, a corn crib, a death trap, was the single warmest, safest structure in the entire territory. The laughter and derision of the autumn months curdled into a thick, profound shame. The next day, Silas returned to Elias's cabin. He did not come with a group, but alone. He stood at the door, his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the hard-packed snow at his feet. When Elias opened the door, Silas did not ask to come in. He looked the quiet man in the eye, and for the first time he did not see a fool or an outsider, but a man of deep and powerful wisdom. The words did not come easy to a man like Silas, a man whose pride was as solid as the foundations he laid. "Teach me," he said, the words barely more than a whisper, yet they carried the weight of a complete surrender. "Please, teach us how." Elias did not hesitate. There was no price, no condition, no demand for an apology. He saw the desperation and humility in the other man's eyes, and simply nodded. "Tomorrow," he said, "when the sun is up, bring the others." He knew this knowledge was not his to hoard. It was a tool for survival, and survival in this place was a communal effort, whether the community knew it or not. And so, he taught them. He led a group of 12 men, the strongest and most respected builders in Providence, down to the hidden bend in the river. He showed them the exact spot to dig, how to identify the blue-gray vein of clay by its texture and its resistance to the shovel. He explained that the common mud of the riverbank would crack and shrink, but this specific clay had a different heart. It held its form. They dug for hours in the biting cold, their skepticism replaced by a feverish determination. They hauled the heavy buckets back to the settlement, a silent, solemn procession of converts. Back in the relative warmth of Silas's barn, Elias showed them how to mix the clay with sand and a little water, kneading it until it had the perfect consistency. He demonstrated the technique, taking a handful and forcing it into a gap between two logs he had set up for the purpose. He showed them how to use the pressure of their palms and the strength of their fingers to create that deep, impenetrable seal. He made them practice, correcting their technique with a quiet patience, showing them how to feel for hollow spots, how to smooth the surface. He was a natural teacher, his economy of words matched by the precision of his movements. The men who had laughed at him now watched his every move with the focused intensity of disciples. They were learning a new gospel, a gospel of clay and warmth. As soon as the storm broke and a spell of clear, cold weather set in, a strange and wonderful transformation began to sweep through Providence. The sound of axes on wood was replaced by the rhythmic thud of shovels into the frozen earth of the riverbank, and the wet slap of clay being worked into walls. Working in teams, and with the desperation of men who had felt the wolf of winter at their door, they began to reseal their homes. It was brutal, miserable work. The wet clay froze to their fingers, and the cold was a constant, aching presence. But they were driven by the memory of the storm and the promise of warmth. They started with the cabin of Thomas, the man with the sick infant. They worked from the inside, packing the walls while his wife and child huddled by the fire. Within a day, the difference was palpable. The drafts vanished. The insatiable hunger of the stove abated. For the first time in weeks, the cabin held its heat. A profound sense of hope began to spread through the community. They were not helpless. There was an answer, and the quiet man they had scorned had given it to them freely. The work continued, cabin by cabin, a communal effort to undo a generation of flawed wisdom. The landscape of the settlement began to change, not in its shape, but in its substance. The cabins, once monuments to a proud but failing tradition, were being reborn from the inside out. By the time the next great snow arrived, Providence was ready. The cabins, now fortified with their core of river clay, held fast against the wind. The interiors were warm and safe. The woodpiles, once a source of constant anxiety, now seemed to stretch further. Their fuel burned with a newfound efficiency. The sound of children coughing was replaced by the sound of their laughter. The community had not just survived the winter of 1878, they had conquered it. They had learned to live with the land, not just on it. The story of the clay-sealed cabins of Providence traveled slowly, carried by trappers and surveyors who passed through the following spring. They would spend a night in a cabin, remarking on its unusual warmth and the strange, smooth interior walls, and they would be told the story of Elias and the winter of the White Fury. The idea, born of ancient wisdom and one man's quiet diligence, began to spread across the territory. In new settlements, builders began to seek out veins of clay, and the Providence method, as it came to be known, saved countless families from the harsh lessons the North was always willing to teach. Elias never sought credit or praise. He remained the same quiet, observant man he had always been. But he was no longer an outsider. He was the wise elder, the man whose counsel was sought on matters far beyond construction. He had taught them more than just a building technique. He had taught them a profound lesson in humility. He had shown them that true strength was not in loud boasts or rigid adherence to the past, but in the quiet willingness to observe, to learn, and to admit when a better way was found. The memory of their laughter in the autumn became a source of communal shame, but also a reminder that wisdom is often found where it is least expected. The winter of 1878 came down on the Blackwood territory like a hammer, but it had forged the scattered, prideful settlers of Providence into a true community, bonded together by the shared experience of failure, redemption, and the enduring warmth of river clay.